The stories contained in this podcast are the recollections of the guests we've invited onto the show. We are an outlet for people to share their truths, and we accept no legal responsibilities for the stories contained herein.
I'm Kendra Sheets.
And I'm Rich Gill.
And this is Enough, a podcast that aims to shine light into the darkened corners of the music industry while discussing the ways we can and should improve ourselves and, in turn, our community.
Welcome back to another episode of the Enough Podcast. I am one of your hosts, Kendra Sheets.
I'm the other host, Rich Gill.
And today, our guest is Corinne. Corinne is in Minneapolis. She does a number of things. She's in a band. She's been on the booking side. She's very active in the music community. But I'm not doing a great job introducing you, so I'll let you introduce yourself. Corinne, can you give us a little bit of information about you?
Absolutely. Hello, my name is Corinne Caouette. I am in a band called Black Widows, which I co-manage with my bandmate Pamela. I'm an independent booker that's booked at several venues and done a bunch of event coordination. I've been on kind of all sides of venues and music and event planning. I also do marketing and social media for a bunch of different film, music, arts organizations throughout the years. And I'm kind of, I would say like an amateur activist. You know, I'm not going to put myself up there with the people who are boots on the ground every day, but I definitely step in to situations and voice my opinions about things.
So, Corinne, we've worked on a few different projects together over the years. How have you seen Minneapolis in particular, but the bigger scene change or not change as the Me Too movement? I mean, I've noticed that people will get really worked up about something for a little bit, and then it sort of fades, and then it'll go back up. How have you seen the music scene work in that way?
Yes, I've seen the same thing where things spread kind of like wildfire. People come forward with maybe each other, even behind closed doors. And then there's kind of an exhaustion, I would say, not only in the lives of survivors and people who have been victimized, but also in just more like mainstream culture on the surface of things. They get excited about the story itself, but not actually about finding a solution to the problem. And I think the biggest issue that I noticed that is repetitive, I think we get a little better at talking about it every time this cycle happens where something comes up. But I think the biggest issue is that people just don't have tools. They don't know how to address it other than just pointing fingers, which is necessary sometimes, but then what? So that's my biggest thing is what do we do next after that? Why do we keep getting stuck in this cycle? Overall, to answer your question, I think people have incorporated this conversation about sexual violence in the music scene into their everyday conversations a little more than maybe 20, 30 years ago. We acknowledge that it's a thing, I think, more than we used to, which is good. Things happen slowly over time. But I also still think there's just no real tangible way to address it by law, even, and through justice. There aren't enough tools.
There's this old guard in punk or music in general, which are kind of this is how it's always been, so this is how it is. And we're not interested in any advancement or change or conversations that we haven't had before. And it seems to be, again, we've talked about this a lot. The younger generation coming up are the ones who are no, we need to talk about this. Consent is important, and safety at shows, and just in general are conversations we need to have. And as they come up, the hope is that it sort of turns the corner and it becomes more normalized, and these conversations do happen more as the old guard kind of starts dying out, so to speak.
That's the hope. But if you look outside of a music scene level, I mean, we've seen that with supposedly Gen Z would save us all, right? But then you see the election results and everything's just as divided as is in every other generation. You've got all of this on one side, and then you had the antithesis of everything because they are just buckling down on these old guard tendencies. They don't want things to change, and they want them, in fact, to go in reverse for where they are currently. So that's a little bit scary. But I think the positive note in all of that is you can't stop the ball once it's rolling, right? With Me Too, it might have seemed like it slowed down, but it changed the culture. It changed the overall tone of how people address these issues. And some of these cases on the larger celebrity-esque realm would have never made it to a court situation if it wasn't for the Me Too movement. So if you still have people having these conversations and holding space for the hope of change, you're not going to be able to remove that from people. Once that fire starts, it's not going to stop burning. You can't extinguish that, which I think is one of the only positive things I'm clinging on to in the next so many years.
I think also like in the integration of more women and more queer people into mainstream culture, that just changes the conversation by default. So like you have more women and women of color directing TV series and films about abuse, about sexual violence from a female perspective. I think now there's relatable content out there that is like legitimized by mainstream culture that anybody can watch now and go, oh, so that's what it's like to experience that. I'm thinking of like Maid.
We had a guest who specifically watched Maid and it snapped her into realizing she was in an abusive relationship.
It's like kind of triggering if you've been in an abusive relationship, but it's also so validating because it's like they walk through what it costs. They put the price of gas, the price of the meal the next day, everything she's trying to do when she's without financial independence as she's trying to leave a domestic partnership that is abusive, you know? And so like the reality of the breakdown of what that feels like and looks like that wasn't around even 20 years ago, I would say, where there was a TV series like that was focused on that specific storyline. And I think just more women are pushing in to say, and more queer people like, no, I'm going to make this thing and I'm going to try to push to get it out there. I think there just wasn't any space for that before. Yes, the like incel community seems to be growing in a weird way, but it might just be louder than we think and not as big as we think and just more intense. And I like to have hope that the average person kind of understands sexual violence is bad. I mean, I would hope so, you know?
Well, if you think about it, like even in older movies, like black and whites, or even in the 50s and 60s, there'd be a situation where, you know, a woman saying something and a man slaps her across the face and she takes herself back and then she makes out with him. We don't see that anymore. That's not a thing that's popularized in any sort of culture. If you see someone smack someone on anything that you're watching, you're like, something's about to happen. And it's not going to be making out with someone. So that I think is kind of also moving its way out of the culture because so much of what we are as individuals is taken from what we consume in some way. And so if we're not watching these things, it's not normalized to us. If it's the opposite of normalized, it's something like Maid, and you realize the repercussions of these types of situations, you might be more prone to see them as they arise.
Yeah. Conversely, though, I think in the 30s and 40s, women like Katharine Hepburn, there were a lot more like smart characters of women who were like self-made, and I feel like there's, in a weird way, less of that now. It's not as attractive to be sassy and smart and on the mark with everything. It's just interesting to watch these cultural shifts. I do think there is a bit of a pendulum. Yeah, I mean, that reminded me what you said of a song, the 50s song, I forget, is it the Shangri-Las? I forget. He hit me and it felt like a kiss.
Yep.
I'm just like, what? I forgot about that song for a while. And I'm like, obviously, like Black Widows have to cover it and do something distorted with it. You know? Just to highlight those lyrics so people can actually hear like how crazy that sounds, especially coming from a female voice. You know, it's just wild.
That whole thing with the song just threw me so far that I'm just like over here now.
I know. It's insane.
Well, what that also made me think of is like how normalized songs like She's Sexy and 17, all these songs about underage girls that bands were just like, they were on the radio. They were huge hits.
Yep.
And you don't really see that anymore, thankfully.
And maybe the artist singing it was like 17, but still.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's creepy.
I don't know, Rich, you don't see it on the radio so much anymore, but as we've talked about before in personal conversations and otherwise, you definitely see similar offshoots of that in pop punk, like Ramones Corey type pop punk, like sugar bubblegum pop punk, where they're like, she's so great, I love her so much, she won't date me, she's a bitch. Like that's still kind of there. And she might not be 17, but it's still this kind of platform idolization and then fall from grace kind of mentality.
That's that entire 2000s, like, emo mall punk genre was built on that.
Yeah.
Which honestly, like, when it comes to punk, this is another thing I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I never, like, my bandmate was really into punk, and I never identified with a lot of it because it was so male, and I just never really identified with male artists. Like, I was listening to PJ Harvey and Bjork, who I considered punk. Bjork's first band, Kukl.
They are.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think how people and Bikini Kill, obviously, you know, and Bikini Kill, I mean, Kathleen Hanna was at shows in the 90s going, get out of the way, and if you act like that, you're going to be held accountable. She was doing that.
You know who you listen to? You listen to the Katharine Hepburns of punk.
Exactly.
It was strong women who were telling you, get the fuck out of the way,
and
I'm
here.
They
were sick of the male punk scene, and they were sick of, like, I don't care. I'm actually not, because there's rules to the male punk scene. And actually, Salad Days, Rich, at Sound Unseen, watching that in Mackay talk about how he was kind of excommunicated for being straight edge and wanting more safety at shows and, like, you know, whatever people feel about his personality. But the point is like the concept of that people thought he was a big bummer because he was asking people not to slam dance to the point of causing concussions or whatever. He was like, I don't want to see people hurt each other. What's so bad about that, you know? And that, I think, is a shift in culture that is bold when people initiate those. I think that was really cool of him to acknowledge that that's a thing that's going on, because you know you're going to lose some fans and you know you're going to lose some people. And that's the risk that most artists don't want to take now, which is why people are spineless. I guess that's the best word I can, because they're afraid of not being liked. And it's like, aren't you punk rock? Who cares? I don't understand. It's ethics.
I've had conversations with artists where they've said things where they don't want to rock the boat because they're scared to, quote unquote, bite the hand that feeds. Like, they don't want to upset the fans. They don't want to get kicked off the label. Well, this is not a situation where, you know, you're making $120K a year from your label and your fans. You're living with 3 other people at 40 plus years old, and you're working 2 or 3 other jobs to make ends meet. That's partially because the society that we live in is fucked and nothing is getting paid out properly in general. That could happen at any sort of job. But when you're leveraging your morals against something like that, and you say, you know, I'm in a punk band, this is what I believe in, but you also don't actively believe in this other thing where you're worried about getting, you know, your finances cut off or your access to fandom or platforming cut off. That's a huge problem for me, personally, as someone who intakes music on a regular basis.
Also, if you consider yourself a community-oriented person, don't you care about people other than yourself? Politics, too. It's like, don't you care about how things are affecting others? It's not just about you and what you need in a moment. It's about how these things, when you don't stand up for something, you're one less voice, and probably you're not going to get booted out, especially if you're a white dude. And a lot of times, those are the people that are most afraid to speak up, are the people who have the least amount of risk, which is super frustrating. It's like, can you at least just stand up for other people with different identities that are being marginalized? It's not that hard.
I'm curious, as someone who you play in a band, you co-manage your band, you make your own records, you book your own tours. How do you sort of navigate dealing with, you know, if you're on a festival with, or playing a show with someone that, you know, you may have heard something about? Like, how do you navigate all that, not having to answer to a label or a booking agent necessarily?
You know, not that, like, these huge opportunities have presented themselves and we have to be like, oh, nah, we're not going to go with that giant label. We're just going to stay over here. But we have had micro doses of things, of opportunities where it feels like working with male engineers and producers. We make strategic decisions to work with women as much as we possibly can. And it never fails us. If I'm just being really honest, the few times we've worked with men where they've paid for our recordings, I call it like getting Phil Spectored, because we're an all-female band. Like, every dude wants to come in and be like, and I'm not going to name names, but I could, oh, I love your sound. Like, let's make a record. I'll make you guys, you know, I'll make you. It's like, we're in our 30s and 40s and we've been playing music for a long time. We're not children. I've been in the studio for 20 years. I'm not new to this. I don't need somebody, but it never starts like that. And so you get kind of swindled sometimes. And then all of a sudden you're in the studio, somebody's paying for it. They want to shop you out. They want to help you. But then you get to the point where you're actually arranging and writing and producing. And we've had it happen more than once where it's like, no, so since we have this negotiation, we get to make all the decisions. And I mean, one person wanted to play a guitar solo, a man, on our record. And I'm like, it doesn't even sound like us. I can't believe in 21 it was, that I have to have this conversation where I literally have to be like, but I want to play guitar on my songs. Am I allowed to do that because you're paying for it? And we basically like mouthed off and then got in kind of a tense situation, and we finished and followed through. But they dropped us and they didn't help us out. And so we do speak up and we get punished for it. So it's a slower grind, but it's okay with us because we have control of our situation. And then we went into the studio with Holly Hansen at Salon Sonics in Northeast Minneapolis, and it was so great. It was so collaborative and like fun. She's super efficient and professional, but like also knew how to. So, I mean, we just really now are like, our experiences going on tour with women. You know, we just went on a little mini tour with the Suffragette. We're all women. They manage themselves. Female agent who books them, who booked us. There's an ease and a comfort and like nobody's patronizing each other. We're all just on the level. It's efficient. It feels right. And I think we just follow what feels good in that way. And we experiment with it. You know, we're not against working with men, but like, it's been pretty beneficial for us to work with women, and we make decisions about that. I mean, it's not like, oh, by accident, like, oh, isn't it cute that we're all girls? It's like, no, like it just, things flow better. So yeah, I would say that like we're very intentional, and we want to support women because women in the music scene, especially in the industry, like booking or, oh my God, it's the percentage of women is still so tiny. So I want to give them my money.
Minneapolis has a lot of women in higher up booking positions. Like the main talent buyer at the Target Center is a woman. One of the higher ups at Live Nation is in town. Live Nation is, Live Nation, but it's a woman of color. It's nice to see that at least some representation where yeah. I know a lot of places are just like, it's all dudes. It's all white dudes in their 50s who run everything.
Representation does matter. I work with a mostly male white booking team, and there are just things they just don't understand that I have experienced or people of color experience. And it is sometimes a grind and sometimes exhausting trying to just explain like sexism and racism 101. I know they get the bigger scope of things, but the nuance of microaggressions and just gatekeeping that people who've been in positions of power their whole lives have never had to deal with. They just don't see it or think it exists. They really don't think it exists. And so it's necessary for people to be in power that, and that is where like younger people too, like younger people coming up, get younger people on your teams, they have a different perspective about things.
So you've actually tried to engage the people that you work with in conversations about what it's like to be sexually harassed and assaulted?
I have, but not in this particular context. That is actually something that is really great at the venue that I work at most of the time. There's a very good understanding that like there's no place for that and that person will be 86th. I feel very confident with the men that I work with that if I mention something, they'll be like, oh yeah, no problem. They're not welcome anymore. But there are people around the fringe still that are kind of hanging around. And there are people on the team that maybe if somebody's kind of a friend of somebody's, it's a little more complicated, which is just, again, a problem of our culture and tools that I think. But comparatively to other venues, I feel really happy. And especially we have a pretty strong queer and trans community of people that book shows with us, and they have expressed that they feel really safe in our venue, and that makes me super happy.
Is security team there?
Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Security is like a BIPOC queer security team that really is founded in like de-escalation And I have like seen them in action multiple times at shows. So they're our primary and only security team, and they are really great at what they do. One problem at venues is that there's a lot of male security people who haven't actually been trained. And we've talked about this, Rich. So they're just the bartender that graduated to being a security person or a door person, but they don't actually have de-escalation training or harm reduction skills or any of that. So if something bad happens, they tend to be violent or don't have the right response to a situation. If somebody's been roofied or they kick that person out because they're too drunk, throw them out on the street, a woman by herself after she's been roofied, because they don't understand what's going on. And so the nice thing about a team like security is that they're watching, they understand that those things happen, and they're on the side of the people, right? You know, they're not just defending the venue from crazy people, which I find to be the case at a lot of clubs and bars. Like, we don't want to deal with the riffraff. Get out of here.
Mm-hmm.
Where security is more like, oh no, what's happening here? Let's see how we can facilitate help in this situation. If somebody's sick or out of it or whatever, you know. No, they would never throw somebody out. They would make sure that person is in a car getting home. And
I've been tossed out of a place because I was too drunk and then just left on the side of the building when I was like 22 years old in downtown Minneapolis. And it was just like, okay, it's like, fuck you.
Literally
Good
going
luck.
through like all of these venues in my head and like situations that I've had or my friends have had or that I've seen with other people and been like, safe place, not safe place, not and going through it all.
I was just talking to somebody about this the other night, and this is what Show Up Collective was trying to do, and maybe we should again, you know, because I've been thinking a lot about it.
Can we talk a little bit about what the Show Up Collective, Show Up Squad was?
It was a survivor-centered, meaning the people that were leading were survivors of sexual violence mainly, and abuse of all kinds, unfortunately. And the goal was to create sort of a third-party group of community, the same way there's like street teams that go out and kind of like work with unhoused population to help facilitate their needs. This idea that we would go to venues and show up in our t-shirt, sober, ready to be of service to somebody, especially at venues that don't have security or don't have cameras, or they're known for, harm, and being present and kind of having a calendar where volunteers show up, and we have a list of ways that we can be good bystanders and tools. So if, we see somebody cornering a woman or a person in a harmful way, we know how to step in a way of de-escalation, where we did some trainings. We planned on doing more before it kind of disbanded, so that everybody that goes in has these tools of understanding of how to de-escalate, harm reduction, how to get people access to cars, and, can we get sponsorship from Lyft? And, they've had a series of issues too, but how do we get people home safely? How do we hold venues accountable? Eventually we were talking about a grading system, which actually Teacup, Minnesota is now doing. So some of the ideas we had are but it's more for artists and their artist treatment than it is safety, but that's a component.
So with the grading system, is that like when you go to a restaurant and they give you like an A or a B? So you do that for venues, saying this is like a C safety venue?
It was a concept that we had that we thought would be a cool way for good venues to be proud that they get an A. And there's nothing official about it other than the community is thank you for being on your shit, And I think that venues in Minneapolis don't have, even in bathrooms, we don't have the tell your, the Angel beer or whatever. We don't even have that posted in any venues in Minneapolis. And that's everywhere else. It's alarming to me. We don't have any kind of code for people who are scared in these venues to signal to bystanders. And therefore, we don't have bystanders around worrying about anybody else. Everybody's just kind of in it for themselves. And, oh God, look, that crazy person. There's judgment more than there's help. And so how do we train people on bystander training? And the people that slammed us, that were in defense of abusers in the scene, were thinking we were trying to police everybody, and it was no, we're just here in case anything goes wrong, because clearly nobody else is paying attention to this stuff. And so We just wanted to be a buffer and be visible.
It was survivor-led, survivor-centered. It was people who worked at venues. It was people in bands. The majority of the people who were involved, I didn't even know until we all kind of got together. A lot of us didn't know each other. I met
like a
Corinne
pre-formed
through
group.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so what if we were also? Like, who cares?
Yeah.
Like, everybody meets at some point and we meet on topics that we care about. There's a reason we gravitate towards certain people in our communities, and
Yeah.
it's nobody's business how we got together. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah. There's another Ian MacKay quote from a different movie. It's mainly about just like small town shows, but it applies to this. You know, it's not a coincidence that these people ended up in the same room together doing this together, because they all felt strongly about it. We did. Yeah, we do.
and I think it's a minority of people, so people feel like clinging to each other. I do think it can be insular, and I think it is healthy to make sure that, I mean, I hate to be this person that's like, we have to fact check and make sure what we're talking about is accurate, because it diminishes often the conversation of, you're never going to know what happened behind a closed door. You have to believe survivors. People don't make this stuff up for the fun of it. It's not fun for people. It's really harrowing and really scary for survivors to speak up. And most of them don't. And there's this big misnomer that like the people that speak up or the people that support them are like going to win and are out to get. It's like, no, they never win. And they're horrified and they're terrified the whole time. They don't. And often they end up just staying silent. I know so many people right now that have been sexually assaulted by big names and they're afraid to come forward, and they probably won't, or they might. But it's not something that people lie about. But my point is, we can't fact check rape that happens in a dark bedroom somewhere or at a party. What do you expect people to do? Just be quiet about it because you know what I mean? It's just such an odd thing. And so we need people that are on the outskirts to buffer and support survivors and speak for them, because it's really scary and really exhausting for them to be that vulnerable all of the time. And so I think it's really important to build those communities, and especially people that aren't affiliated, like men. I know there were some men that when we were doing that were just in the music scene. I remember one guy approaching me, how can I help? He was in his probably mid-late 50s, and he was like, I remember when this was happening at First Avenue 30 years ago, and I wanted to do something about it. And he definitely got it. I didn't even have to explain it to him. And he didn't know any of those survivors. He just knew that this stuff goes on and that it's gross and that nothing is really being done about it. I think there was an uptick in outsiders kind of being like, how can I get involved? I don't think we were ready to handle it on the scale that it needed to be handled. And because survivor-led, survivors have trauma. They can get exhausted and they need to take breaks. And so with organization, you need to be ready for that and have a second option. And we just weren't. But we could again.
There's no one saying we can't do it.
Well, like Kristen and I were talking about, like even making what I really want to do is just make some infographics and have some tools for people.
That was another thing we had talked about at one point. Podcast episodes like this, you know, your story about how you navigate this and how people can do things in their own time in their own city are sort of, you know, what we're hoping to do.
Yeah, like some data, some statistics so that people can actually see, like, this is how often this happens. Here's the identities of people it happens to. Here's the identities of perpetrators. I mean, there are facts around this stuff. I mean, yes, data is kind of open-ended, but like there is some good research around this stuff. And then also like, how do you talk to people who have had something really horrific happen to them yesterday or today? Or I think a lot of people actually do want to help, but they just have no idea how. And I think there is this thing of like, don't speak for people, but then stand up for them. And I think that does get confusing, to be honest, like for a third party or somebody who doesn't understand this stuff. Like, I don't know what you want me to do. You don't want me to say anything about what happened to you to anybody, but I'm supposed to help you. I don't know what to do. So I'm just going to go away from this. And I think that's it's huge, you know, it's a problem. People are always going to criticize, so whatever. okay, I'm not a, super famous person, but we have some packed shows, and every opportunity I have to get on the mic and say something about the room and make it safe. I don't always do it because maybe it sometimes feels unnecessary because I kind of already know who comes to our shows, but I think it's always a good practice. Like often we'll say, hey, and I just watched that Kathleen Hanna documentary again. She did the same thing where it's just like, if anybody feels unsafe, come sit at our merch table and hang with us and let us know, and we'll talk to the management or security about it and make sure that you're safe. There's nothing wrong with saying that, and it like weirds some people out to put themselves on the spot. Again, people are really afraid of like rocking the boat or stepping out of their like stage character or something. Like it's going to ruin the vibe if we talk about politics or injustice. And I'm like, you know what ruins the vibe? Rape.
Yeah.
Like that ruins the frickin' vibe. So like, or racism or whatever. Like we have definitely kind of told some people not to come to our shows because they put racist content on and they like us. And it's like, we don't want you here. That kind of stuff. Like, so what? We lose a few fans. We gain more by creating a community that feels good and people come back to. And I think like as a band, we've done a fairly good job of that. I think people know that they can come to our shows, especially women, and feel like we're going to look out for them. And that makes me really proud and really happy. They know that we'll speak up if something weird happens. We have to lead too as artists and people that have some voice, and bookers and industry people, on how to do that, even by example. Because I notice way more people cheer when we say stuff like that than I think they're going to. Yes, it's usually women and it's usually people who have gone through horrible experiences, but everything is contagious and people don't think they can be a leader. They think they have to kind of like follow what's going on because if they step out, it's dangerous. I even challenge some survivors. I hate to say things are scalable, but as a white woman who had somebody say something kind of off color to them is different than being a Black queer woman who was physically assaulted and left somewhere or without resources. Like those are different experiences. And so if you do have some power in your identity or like it wasn't that bad, you should speak up. You should try to organize and get more people to collect because power in numbers actually works. I think there's fear of like, there's this backlash, say something, and it's like, that's why you have to collect and do things together because it actually works and it scares perpetrators. It really does. Lead, don't follow. Isn't that punk? I don't know.
Not to bring up Sound and Scene again, but, this movie is Something Better Change, which is a documentary about the band DOA. Their whole motto was talk minus action equals zero.
Exactly.
So, you can sit back and like, sit behind your computer and like say, oh, fuck Chris Brown or whatever. But like, what are you doing?
It has to start in your families and your friendships and your communities nearby. Like that's where it matters really, ultimately. But I heard like one kind of cheesy self-help podcaster guy talk about trauma and like how all the things we experience, lack of health, bad relationships, addiction, sit on top of trauma. And you got a roto-rooter to get down into the trauma and actually deal with that. It's cheesy, right? It's this cheesy self-help stuff, but it's true.
Yeah.
When you fix that core problem, everything else starts to make sense and unfold. And I think people are only dealing with the symptom. Oh, well, I should eat vegan because it's better for my health. And it's a me thing rather than us. And like, what if we all kind of tried to get to the foundation of colonialism, of land back? All of this stuff is at the core of why there's slaughterhouses, why there's rape and abuse. And it's actually not that complicated. It's that a bunch of white dudes came in here and decided they were going to take everything and kill everybody. And we're all just trying to rationalize our way through that because we're the ancestors, some of us, of that pain. And like, how do we get out of that? How do we heal from that? And part of that is just listening to each other and being like, I hear you. Sometimes that's all people need.
Mm-hmm. It's so true.
I hear you and I believe you, And I'm sorry that that happened to you. And like, it's that simple. And so many people are resistant to that. And it's bizarre.
When it comes to something like that, it's like, well, I don't know what to say. It's like, sometimes you don't have to say anything except for, I hear you, I see you, I believe you. Like, I'm sorry that happened. Like, sometimes that's enough.
That notion of like urgency and saviorism, having to like fix everything all the time and like problem solve. Like, sometimes you just need to listen. I've been called in certain grassroots organizations I've worked in and stuff by women of color, like by different people that have been like, hey, you're kind of like a lot and like centering yourself. And I'm like, fair. I'm like, but I'm like, I know I need to shut the F up and sit with it, sit with the discomfort, think about what that means, even if I feel like I was being interpreted the wrong way. It doesn't matter because that person felt that way from me. I affected that person in a bad way for some reason. And there is truth to that, even if I don't agree with it or whatever. And I think we're just so quick to be like, well, I didn't mean it like that. So it's, and you know, you're disqualified from having any issue with me. It's so weird, you know? Like, if I hurt somebody, I want to figure out why.
That comes from growth, though, because I think that initial response is like, no, I didn't, is a trauma response. It's because you're protecting yourself. The idea of who you are is being threatened in some way by an outside force. And you're like, no, I've been working on myself. I'm good. And someone doesn't see what you see exactly. It's automatic threat for someone who's experienced some sort of trauma. And everyone has. Trauma is a thing that every single person has gone through in some way.
That just makes me think too of like, Rich, maybe you've had experiences with this, with like talking to men who have either been victimized or have been perpetrators. We need men to be more vulnerable about their experiences too, because men have experienced trauma. I know plenty of men who were sexually abused as children. And often, because we live in a hyper-masculine society, like, men carry on those traditions, unfortunately, rather than become vulnerable and sensitive to the fact that they don't want to continue that cycle. But that doesn't mean they don't hold trauma and they don't hold pain and that they don't deserve to heal. I would just ask you, like, do you think there's a space for men to start those conversations soon in kind of mainstream culture? You know, I don't really see it happening much, but it feels like there's a desire for it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it starts on a smaller level, you know, with your friends. And then as it sort of like branches out. I mean, Terry Crews came out with his story, but has there really been another major male celebrity who has talked about being abused in the industry that's not Corey Feldman, who has his own predatory issues and
he's just horrible at music.
There's that too. Yeah.
Get out of there. Just get out of there, buddy.
Or, you know, Drake Bell, who also has his own issues with perpetrating against people. Again, they kind of just like, they're there, people are interested for a minute, and then they just move on to the next whatever.
Or get mocked, maybe, right?
Yeah.
Like, the vulnerable male still gets mocked. You're a joke if you talk about your feelings. And I think, like, it's the same with the queer communities, particularly the trans community. There's such a backlash on any kind of femininity again. It's like there's such a hate for femininity of any kind, whether it's coming from a man or a non-binary person, or we just want to shut it down so hard. There's like such a masculine energy pumping through everything right now, and it feels weird. Social media is a problem for that. And I click on the clickbait. I'm not by accident, kinda, but I'm like, oh my God, I got to see more about this. I'm such a sucker. I'm like, what am I doing? But it's so easy.
It's designed that way.
Right, exactly. And like, it gets in your brain, and then you even start kind of being like, oh, maybe that person is kind of a joke. You know, you start believing this stuff, that you're reading these dumb headlines that are not that person's actual life or situation.
But we do have to think about like what we're taking in, right? And if we keep that very cognizant in our mind, that people do absorb whatever sort of conversation or music or movies or whatever podcasts that they're listening to, and their brain is doing some sort of formatting of that information. That just really speaks to how important it is to have conversations with people, one-on-one conversations about these certain topics, because you could be saying the one thing that they need to hear that forms that kind of pearl of an idea that sits there and goes over and around for a month or two, and all of a sudden they spit out an idea that they never really thought they would come to before. So I think that's really important in a lot of ways. And I know we got there by talking about clickbait, but we got there. So
well, and I was going to add, there's like, that's why there's this entire generation of like young white males who subsist on a diet of like Fox News, Joe Rogan, and like Barstool Sports. And that's how you end up with these normalized, terrible conversations about how women are treated.
I think people are not taught how to, especially in this culture, formulate their own ideas, because capitalism wants us to be dependent and spoon-fed on everything. And it's not an accident. It's not an accident. And so people watch what happens in the comments and they go, oh, is this cool? Is this cool? Is this cool? Like, most people are kind of like trying to read how they fit in, especially the people who are on the right and like, or libertarian, who are like, freedom and nobody's going to tell me what to do except Joe Rogan, you know, and I'm going to do everything.
That's the thing that gets me. And we're about to get real political, but like the whole, no one's going to tell me what to do crowd.
Except for this guy, except for this douchebag.
Exactly. That's the thing that gets me. Like,
this douchebag is going to do, I'm going to wear all of his, I'm going to buy all of his stuff. I'm going to follow all of his rules. It's like, don't you want more complexity in your diet in general if you're really, truly trying to be a rebel?
They're there to crush the system. And the mentality, it's interesting because the mentality of some of these people very much aligns with punk mentality, which is why I think we're starting to see the kind of right-wing, like usually older white punk dudes. It's this whole, you can't tell me what to do, I'm my own person, fuck you if you try, anti-government mentality. But what that's the surface level. That's the candy-coated shell of the bullshit that they're feeding you. It's not actually that at all. What you're doing is over-conforming, over-consuming, and you're just spitting out talking point narratives that someone else has constructed for you. You're not thinking on your own accord. It's the same way that they talked about the importance of like the spin room, for example, or watching these like political, like half of the stuff on TV and on YouTube, and we're really in the weeds on politics here. But
it's all important. It relates.
It does all relate. And I was going to say it's similar when we're talking about abuse, assault.
Our president that's being sworn in, our president on January 6th, is a rapist. So this very much pertains. We uphold pedophiles and rapists in this culture, and then pretend like that's not what they are. You know,
right?
These people who are like, smash the system, like can't tell me what to do. You're listening to, you know, Joe Rogan, and I'm even gonna throw Fat Mike in there. Like, these are fucking millionaires who are like part of the system. They're not smashing shit.
Yep. No, they're making money off of your idiocracy and your lack of like ability to through facts. But it's like, why do we bother even talking to that group of people? Because obviously they are brainwashed to a certain degree. But I mean, we need to have these conversations in a more global way. But I think when people try to fight online with some of these guys, or like, just go like read books to elderly people in your community that are lonely and isolated. No, seriously.
That'd be great. Yes.
Go do something that's actually meaningful and like helps a person feel better about their life than like waste your energy and time, because it's just going to agitate you. They're not going to listen. They don't care. They've already decided. I do think there are people somewhere in the middle. That people are complex, I think, now more than ever politically, because of identity politics. And like, it's really weird seeing queer people of color voting for Trump. You know, the statistics that came out about like Native people voting more for Trump than, because there's so much misinformation. It's not that people are voting because they think Trump is an amazing person. They're voting based on what they think they need at this moment that they're not getting.
So I think one of the interesting things that can happen when you do speak up is, as we've talked about, there's a repercussion. There's a reaction for every action, right? And sometimes when you do speak up or speak out, this strange thing happens that we've talked about before on the podcast. It's Darvo. And it basically is the reversing of victimization.
So for those who are unfamiliar or maybe don't remember, DARVO stands for Deny, Attack, Reverse, Victim, Offender.
It's attacking the survivor's credibility. It attacks their story. It manipulates people around them.
But beyond that, it actually mirrors the victimization in a way that they remove that victimization and take it on themselves to make them look. It's very twisted.
Right. It's the gaslighting of blame.
And it's
that makes sense.
Donald Trump does it. Great to bring you back. Does it all.
I've always found this to be so fascinating. And in a prior conversation, we had a really good talk about it and kind of where did it come from almost. And there's a lot of this where I feel like when we've, over the years, when I've had conversations on the podcast, off the podcast with people, the one thing that is so consistently baffling yet intriguing to me is like people are using a playbook. Everyone has the same moves all the time. Like, where is this book? Why don't I have a PDF for this? I would like to take a look at it because it's someone, let's say someone comes forward and says, person A raped me. Because of that, I've gone through all of these issues. I am in therapy and I'm working on myself, but I wanted to share my story. DARVO would be the situation where person A would then come forward and then they would come up with their own response, in quotes, to what the survivor had stated, but they would switch themselves out as the person who has now had to deal with all of this. They're the victim. Their life has been changed because of what has gone on. What is the point of this? Corinne, tell me more about what you think. Like, what is the mentality here?
It's very effective in that, like, people don't have to change. They don't have to make sacrifices. I mean, there is a person in our Minneapolis music scene who did this very thing and immediately responded with a kind of vacant apology that was probably being formulated because he knew this was going to happen. And so the messages I got from people surrounding him were like, you have to do, this person is working on themselves. This person has been through so much. Like, look at what you're doing to him. This is going to change his family. This is going to it changed all of his victims' lives. And they can barely leave their house half the time because they feel so it's the immediate, basically like stealing of that experience that person has had and going, nope, you don't get to have that. I get to put it on myself because that way I can shield myself from any criticism. It's very effective. Somehow we always fall in love with the predator.
Well, there's a huge spike in that now where they're like, let's put Zac Efron as the serial killer. He's dreamy and all the girls will want to bang him.
Or men are more believable because they're more down to earth, right? Like men are tweeting the facts. And I mean, men have been victims as well. Women have been perpetrators. You can use in behaviors, but generally speaking, it is men that are upholding this stuff. Yeah, it's definitely effective in that, like, it's playing off of what our culture loves to eat up. And so it's easier for our brains to go, oh, yeah, I've seen this movie. Like, I know how this goes. That is comfortable to me. I can understand that and process that. This woman is probably just crazy or she wants money. And it's like, I have never met a survivor that even wants money from, we don't even get to that point in the conversation of even thinking about the possibility that anybody would ever even be held accountable enough to get money. That's like a far-fetched thing. They just want an apology, And so I think it's that they know they can work that angle because it's supported even by women in our culture,
Is the I have substance abuse issues, I've been drunk for years part of DARVO?
Yes, 100%. I mean, in this case, I think when it comes to rape and sexual abuse in the music scene, yeah, and I think especially in the music scene, because it's like Peter Pan culture, nobody's expected to grow up. Nobody's expected to be a good guy. People are just expected to be flamboyant and fun and wild and rock and roll, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And sorry, what did you expect? It's rock, it's punk. That was a long time ago. Well, okay, that's cool. And I understand to some degree you were a victim of your culture. We all were. But like this person had an extra level of victimization. Do you think you can just acknowledge that you did a shitty thing? And I just think it's so easy to just pull the covers over that and be like, well, it was a different time.
If it was a different time, fine. It was years ago, fine. But if you actively have made no changes in your life and you've never taken accountability for your actions, was it really a different time, or was it just 20 years ago where now you're just wrinklier?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. If suddenly you work on yourself, like, aren't you kind of like, wow, that was really shitty of me?
Right. I find it baffling, and I think you really touched on it with the Peter Pan syndrome of all music communities, all music scenes, like maybe besides like maybe like orchestra.
Kind of semi-funny level, like the guys that I've dated or the guys that I know in the Minneapolis scene who have been perpetrators of abuse and rape are actually the band and orchestra guys who realized once they joined a rock band after high school, they could like get it, and then they just started acting like assholes because they thought that was what they were supposed to be, when in fact they're probably not actually like that internally. It's weird. It's like a facade, you know? And then there's like no apology because they don't know how to go back to would have been like for them, which is being a nice person who's kind of a nerd, which is what women actually want to be around.
It will consistently be shocking for the rest of my life that it is so hard for people to apologize for past behaviors. Like, we've all fucked up. Especially, and Rich and I have talked about this before, the culture has changed so fast. Just the idea of kids being taught consent in schools is not something that I would have ever thought would happen. It's regular. It happens in classrooms all the time. And that was never something that I was taught. It was not what Rich was taught. It's not what a lot of us were taught. And things are changing so rapidly that if you, just like a tweet from 2004 brought in today's 2024 culture, you're going to say some ugly shit 20 years ago, 10 years ago, because it does not align with where we are as a culture right now. But all you have to do is be understanding to the fact that that was then you, and you actually have done work on current you, and apologize to the person that either you harmed or that found that terrible tweet or what the fuck ever it was. Like, give yourself a little grace and say, you know, that was me then and this is me now. Hopefully I'm a different version of myself, but also take accountability for then you. 'Cause like, you did some dumb shit. We all have. No one is out on a ledge there being like, it's only you who fucked up the last 20 years. Like, it's all of us.
Well, and I think the conversation, you know, one thing I think about if I ever lead in these conversations is like, I do need to do my own damage control and think about how I've been in situations. It's like, yes, it's scalable. I've never, ever sexually assaulted anybody, but have I maybe not checked in with people when I made decisions? Have I, like, consent is bigger than just sex. And I think if we practice consent at every level, even with my mom who has had disability at times, and like, do I make sure she can keep up with me when we're on a walk? Like, do I check in with her and go, is it okay that we go on this 3-mile walk that I'm about to take you on when maybe you're going to get winded? I just take for granted that I'm in my zone doing things and I'm not thinking about how it's affecting other people. And I think like I'm trying to always work on, where have I not done that enough in my life? Where have I not checked in with people to see, like, just always ask questions and be like, is this okay? How do you feel about this? And I think the more we do that, we can then go back in our history and go, oh, I didn't do that. And that felt kind of bad. And then, yeah, maybe it is weird to bring it up. I actually thought about a situation recently where I bullied a girl I worked with, thinking I was being funny, because she responded with laughter. There might have been flirtation involved, and I thought she was like flirting with me, and so it was funny, and no. It wasn't anything major, but it was just, I would like hide stuff and like kind of play practical jokes on her and stuff because I thought we had this funny thing. And then one day she just lost it on me. And she's like, I'm so sick of you doing this to me. It really bothered her. And I was like, oh my God, you know? And like, I had this whole like come to Jesus moment where I was like, I misread this situation so bad. I did feel defensive, but my first response was, I'm really sorry. And you can say I didn't mean to do that. With that comes responsibility. And like, I can't do that anymore. And I have to really check myself if I do. So I've been aware that's bothered me. Like, I've lost sleep. And that happened like 15 years ago. And I'm sure there's other things I don't even think of. But we all have stuff like that where it's like, Ugh, so cringy.
For sure. I think a lot of the things that I remember, like the things that I lose sleep over, are things I said in a joking manner that may not have landed properly. Or I don't understand fully who my audience was at that drunken night at the bar. And when I said something, you just look at the person, you're like, fuck, that was not, like, whatever I just said was not what. And then you try to, like, maybe days later apologize and they brush it off. And then 10 years later, you're on your couch in Chicago thinking about all the shit you've ever done wrong since you became sober, and you now are having flashbacks of all the dumb shit you've ever done. Like, I think that's all part of the process of growth, right? Like, because if you didn't grow, you wouldn't be thinking back through those things. You'd still be living as that person in those moments, thinking every joke I make is funny, and we can joke around about, like, hey, rape this, and that's so gay that. We're way past that now. That literally shows that we've grown as people, which is a positive thing. But also, as you said, taking personal and sometimes like external accountability by reaching out to those people. I reached out to someone from college recently for a situation that occurred between me and a violent partner that this person was kind of put in the middle of. And she was like, I completely forgot about that. And I was like, I think about it every day and have for 15 years.
Yeah. Well, that's a good point too, is like, how do we, like, some people might not want to hear about it or remember or go down that road. And then we also have to be okay with people who have caused harm with that being the response, or just like pushing it a little bit and being like, hey, I know I did this thing to you like 10 years ago. Do you even have any interest in my apology? Like, I think you can even ask consent at that level. Or is it, do you not care? Or is it triggering? I don't want to like bring all this up. I think that's how I would approach, like that person that I hurt. I thought about reaching out to her and I'm like, she probably doesn't even remember. I'm not important, but what I did was not okay. You know what I mean? And that's a weird thing of like self-importance. Just because it bothered me, did it really ultimately like affect her in a deeper way? I don't want to think that I had that big of an impact on everybody I come into,
Also, part of the healing process for yourself personally and the growth process is closure. It's a human response. And so you reach out to people hoping that they're going to give you that check of approval so you can close that chapter and you can keep growing. But that doesn't always happen. So you have to be okay with moving forward without the closure.
But isn't the point of that to center the person that was harmed? And so therefore your goal, it shouldn't be getting closure for yourself. It should
100%.
be identifying that you did the thing and just acknowledging it. And if they're like, fuck you have to be okay with that.
Right. I think the human response is I need that closure to grow, but the like more mental response is I need to check in with that person so they can get past this thing that I think might be impeding them as well.
Yeah.
And I've had those conversations and had both reactions where, some people are like, oh, I haven't thought about that in forever. Thank you for reaching out, but it was totally unnecessary. And then there are other people who are like, I'm really glad you reached out. Thank you for apologizing for that.
Everybody's at different levels of growth themselves. So they might have caused harm the last 10 years. And if you are apologizing, that means they have to apologize. But that is the beauty in it. Like, even if that person doesn't want to have a conversation with you, somewhere in their noggin, that's resonating. And so maybe in 5 years from now, they're like, oh, wow, that was really cool that that person reached out. Maybe I should do the same to the person I do think we affect each other that way. And so I think like leading by example, again, is like something we need to get more comfortable with rather than just accusing people. And yes, we can hold people accountable, but with that, like, how do we find solutions, and how do we like give tools to people around us to be like, here's a positive thing you can do to affect change. And I think that's what will sell it to people who may not have the vocabulary or whatever, oh, well, okay, well, I see the positive side of that. So I don't want to be part of cancel culture, but I get what you're saying. I'm always about like hearts and minds, like how do you get people? It's less about do I think they're right for thinking that way, and more about, but can I just persuade this person to come a little closer to this mentality?
Do you think that we're going to get there as a population, just let's say countrywide? Do you think we'll get to a point where the patriarchal misogyny and the lack of accountability for males will slowly dissipate to the point where people feel comfortable with acknowledging that they had faults, just like every person does, and eventually get to a point where more than 50% of these type of interactions would be something that becomes, I don't know if I want to say beneficial per se to the survivor, but somewhat of a healing experience where instead of now where they're kind of just being shut down and shut out. It just seems like we've been going through this game for like 70 years and it's just different phraseology is being used over and over. It's now cancel culture and it's triggering and it's this and that. And before there were other verbiage for it. Like, will we ever get to a point where this just no longer is a talking point because it becomes common culture?
I don't think humans will ever be a we. I mean, I just think like we're going to go into our groups and I think I think a lot of good, like the best kind of like cultural mentors and guides and social justice leaders are people who kind of speak about like, stop trying to convince these people that harm you. Come just build your own community and surround the whole thing of self-love and like radical self-love of like just like focus on yourself and do you and like try to find people that value the same things you do. I think that's what people are moving more toward, at least I think survivors. And I think that is liberating in and of itself rather than trying to convince these jerks to like listen to you and respond to you because they're probably not going to, you know, and they might be a breed that dies off eventually because they lose some sort of superpower that they have. But if they don't, the zombie apocalypse is coming and then people are going to have to rely on each other in totally new and different ways. So like, I think people don't feel things until it happens to them or it happens to somebody they love. And unfortunately, that's just how human beings are because we're not very smart as a species, even though we pretend to be.
But we're at a rate now where almost everyone is experiencing some level of trauma. And it's like, I don't want to get this wrong, but is it 1 in 3 women are now sexually assaulted? At a certain point, everyone's going to know someone or be someone.
Why can't we just talk about it? I know. I think that conversation in particular needs to be normalized. Like, hey, we've all experienced this. Every woman I've ever talked to has been assaulted or raped, you know, like unfortunately. And really horrific. Like I find it all the time that my really close friends have experienced some just horrific things. And it's like, oh yeah, well, that's just part of being a woman, you know? I think we have more agency with each other and like more power as collectives than we have before. And I have confidence there. Like I do know women in power who are doing good things. I do know where to go if I need support. Not everybody has that, even now in certain cultures that are so misogynistic where women can't even walk down the street without violence happening or child brides. It's like I have so much privilege to have so much agency to be like, go, which is what I'm going to continue to do. Somehow that resonates, I think, and creates more space for others to do the same.
Enough is a podcast centering on surviving abuse, harassment, and assault in the music scene. To help get the word out, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. If you have been on the receiving end of harm from someone, be it artist, venue owner, booking agent, audience member, or someone else, and would like to share your story on a future episode, please reach out to us at thisisenoughpodcast@gmail.com. All correspondences are kept confidential.